All right. So everybody's quick bios for our quick lightning round. Alexis Antracoli is the Assistant University Archivist for Technical Services at Princeton University's Mudd Manuscript Library, where she leads Technical Services Operations. Last summer, she oversaw the migration of accessions data to ArchivesSpace and discovered the need to find new ways to produce old reports. I'm sure that's something many of you have to deal with. Alexis also teaches in the Archival Studies graduate program at Rutgers University. Her professional interests include enhancing access to collections, web archiving, and collection development. Lisa Calahan is the head of archival processing at University of Minnesota Library's Archive and Special Collections from 2014 to present. She holds an MLIS from Dominican University and an MA in Public History from Loyola University, Chicago. She has been an instructor for ArchivesSpace since December 2014 and is currently overseeing the implementation of ArchivesSpace at the University of Minnesota. John Herbert is the Director of Technology Services at LYRASIS. He joined LYRASIS in April 2015 and leads their hosting services and enterprise IT teams. Prior to joining LYRASIS, he served as head of digital ventures and program director for the Utah Digital Newspapers at the University of Utah's Marriott Library. John led the development of their nationally renowned digital library and was instrumental in many regional and national initiatives, especially the formative years of NEH's National Digital Newspaper Program. Prior to working with the University of Utah, John served in several technology and operations leadership positions with the American Express Traveler's Check Group, including being responsible for printing and shipping the traveler's checks to every corner of the globe. Through his various leadership positions, John has gained excellent knowledge of leading business operations, incorporating technologies to support them, and providing superior service, all while spearheading collaboration in our communities. John holds an MBA from the University of Utah and a bachelor degree in computer science and mathematics from the University of Kansas. Alexandra Orchard, certified archivist, is the technical and metadata archivist at the Ruther, is that? Yeah, okay. Ruther Library, Wayne State University. She is the editorial board chair of Archival Issues and the outgoing SAA Description Section newsletter editor, and also the chair of Wayne State University's President's Commission on the Status of Women. Ms. Orchard received her MLIS and archival certificate from Wayne State University and has a background in English, art, and computer science. Orchard's research interests include archival theory, description and technologies, as well as women and pop culture. She has presented at SAA, MAC, and the Michigan Archival Association. We also have Devon Proudfoot, who is a project archivist from the University of Michigan's Bentley Historical Library. He is a member of Bentley's ArchivesSpace implementation team and also deals with accessioning and processing of new archival material. So we're going to go in alphabetical order today. And everyone's going to keep it to about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time to talk to you at the end. So, actually, I'm going to have Alexis up first. Okay. All right. So, okay, you should be good to go.
Hello, everyone. So if you were in the reports session this afternoon, some of this will be familiar. I'm not going to go into as much detail in a lightning talk. But this is how I create reports in ArchivesSpace. So why did I decide to do this? At the time when I needed to start pulling reports data, we had just migrated our accessions data over to ArchivesSpace, and the reports functionality in ArchivesSpace wasn't fully functional. I decided that the Jasper reports was a pretty steep learning curve, and I was like, there's got to be an easier way to do this. And I also still need data that isn't available through the standard reports. So I needed some way to like customize what I was getting. So how did I do this? I read all the documentation. I decided that the best way to do this was to set up an ODBC connection to the database. I failed a whole lot. I tried every last thing, and finally I just kind of threw my hands up and I said, hey, systems department, can you help me with this? And they basically, what they did for me was they set up a PuTTY connection where I can connect straight to the archives, a read-only copy of our actual current data. So I just tunnel in through PuTTY with my regular Princeton credentials, and then I'm connected to a read-only copy of our data in ArchivesSpace, and I can then connect through Excel to the database. So in Excel, I go to the Data tab, and I use Microsoft Query, and what that does is it'll pull up and allow me to connect to a read-only copy of the database. So once I do that, I then have to set up a query. And I knew a little bit of SQL, so I was able to sort of know what I was trying to do. But even if you don't have to actually write the SQL query. You can actually just select the fields that you want here. And it will give you a list of the tables that are available and then the fields within those tables. And so you can select what you want. In this screenshot, it just shows that I selected repository ID, which you have to know which repository you want to pull the data from. And that I work with 2 different collections, so I want to make sure I'm only pulling data from one at a time when I'm doing this. And then you can set limits. So say you wanted all the fields that are listed over here, repository ID, identifier. I can't read them from here very well, and they're too small on the screen. But then you can narrow it down. Say you only want dates before or after a certain period. And you can do that with each field if you want. From there, you will get your results in an Excel spreadsheet like this. This is an example of a report that tells us all of the university archives accessions that we got in a particular time period that were gifts. And this is something that we need to know and was actually really hard for us to get that data out of Archivist Toolkit, and this actually makes it easier. So once I was successful with this one, I started to ask my staff, what else do you want to know? And they came up with other things. For example, I know this report exists now, but processing status. What are the processing statuses of various collections that we've gotten, since the beginning of the year, for example. And I can just pull it into an Excel spreadsheet and send it to them, and I get the most up-to-date data. So what are some tips here? You'll need to know a little bit of SQL, or at least how databases work, so you can select the fields for the data that you want and know a little bit about constructing a query. You'll need to figure out what the codes are for the various fields in ArchivesSpace. So if your repository is University Archives, it's not going to say University Archives in the database. You need to know what number it is in the database to be able to pull only University Archives accessions, if that's what you want. And when I was at the session on reporting, someone talked about creating a data dictionary for ArchivesSpace, and I hope that will be available to folks, because that would be incredibly helpful. So you just have to know. Generally, what I'll do is I'll pull a really general report with all the codes, and then I can figure out from there which code or number that I want in my report. The Microsoft Query Editor is actually helpful for some of the more complex queries. I use that sometimes, and you'll probably have to ask for help at some point. I've had to many times, and setting up the connection is a little more difficult than it might seem, or at least it was for me. So I hope that's helpful to folks. It's a pretty easy, if you know a little bit about databases and you can use Excel and get an ODBC database connection to a read-only copy of your database, you can pull all kinds of reports from ArchivesSpace.
So next up is Lisa Calahan.
Hello, I'm the head of archival processing at the University of Minnesota, and I have worked with ASC, or Archives and Special Collections, for about 3 years. And as its name alludes, my processing unit, the central processing, works with the 14 different collecting units, or we would call them repositories in ArchivesSpace. And one of my jobs is to make sure everyone is moving closer to centralization, which is super fun. So, a quick history. Most of the archival units in ASC started out as their own entities, their own divisions in different departments. Started with a gift of collection, which also came with money to fund for staff, and over time, those have changed. So a good but underutilized analogy would be that they were silos. And now, with the building of our library in 2000, they just pushed the silos closer together. So they were newer, shinier silos, all in the same building. It's a 3-store building. When they first moved in, every department still had their own reading room. Each floor had their own reading room. And since then, we now have one reading room and centralized staff. So as budgets change and people leave and there are shifts in the department, there's been opportunity for consolidation. So my interest in implementing a content management system. We were a university that did not have a content management system. Some had homegrown systems that were based off of Access, but most used spreadsheets to create inventories. So I knew that when I started, it would be one of the first things I wanted to do because I could not envision a future of hand-coding EAD. It was not a happy future for me. It took me all of 3 weeks of figuring out what I had to do before I said, nope, we're going to try and do something else, and maybe now that I'm a new person here, we can take this opportunity to do it. All right, so here are some of the few informal and very quick thoughts on pre and post implementation. So we implemented almost exactly a year ago. So staff have been using ArchivesSpace for 1 year, and our public interface has been live since September. So we're approaching our 1 year mark, and we're very, very, very excited for the new implementation of the PUI. All right. In addition, we spent a lot of time because of that planning ahead a lot. We have a very great system of when new collections come in, we create processing plans. We create a hierarchical structure for that plan so that when it does get to a student, we know what the final product should look like without actually having spent time in the collection, much past a box inventory. So what that would result in is a lot of miscellaneous series because students get to that collection and there's not a hierarchical structure for the one horseshoe. So we get a lot of miscellaneous structure. And so we spent a lot of time ahead of processing collections figuring out what to do. So after ArchivesSpace, we, aside from the happy dance that I do every morning because I don't have to hand code EAD, ArchivesSpace is changing the way we process our collections. For one, we don't have a lag time between creating an inventory, making edits, and the publication. The only lag time we have is whether or not we push publish or not. It's up to us, which is a huge game changer. We've also noticed that because we don't have to spend all of the pre-time preparing a collection for a student, essentially what we can do is say, student A, here are 3 boxes. Folder them if it's necessary, inventory the collection, and then we'll figure out the hierarchical structure after you're done. And then we can make the edits very easily, move things around, and build a collection that matches what's actually in the box. In addition, we're an MPLP institution anyway, but now we can provide more description. So we're not worried about whether our physical order matches our intellectual order. And we were vaguely worried about that before, but now we can completely separate from it. We don't have to have an oversized series just because materials are oversized. We can describe things where they belong intellectually, which is wonderful for us, again, because we can put more of our efforts into describing things rather than worrying about building a set hierarchy. In addition, we've also noticed that our students, project staff, anyone else inventorying or entering information into ArchivesSpace are taking more initiative. It's wonderful to see that our undergraduate students who are new and coming in, working in ArchivesSpace, are seeing the relationship to the bigger picture and not just the item that they're inventorying in the box, and are making suggestions. So they'll come to me and say, hey, I found 8 horseshoes. Maybe there should be a horseshoe series. Does that make sense? And then we can talk about it, and they can create a series and enter information in there. And even if it's wrong or we have a teachable moment, it's not permanent in the way that it was for us before. So that, in a nutshell, is what I wanted to talk about. And we're curious to see, as we have more time to develop our processing workflows that more closely match what we're doing in ArchivesSpace, how that will change further, and if our processing strategies change to match the tool, or the tool matching what we need to process our collections. Thank you.
Okay, so now we have John Herbert. There we go.
Okay, before I get started, I have a question to ask. It's really important. How many folks in the room have ever used a traveler's check? Wow. Okay, I'm impressed. I thought it was going to be none, and then I was going to say, well, that's why I left 15 years ago. So, which I did anyway. So I want to talk a little bit about integrations. I mentioned this in the integration breakout this morning at LYRASIS. We're working on an integration with Islandora. So this screen up here is a little small. I'm going to have to put my glasses on so I can read this a little better. So at LYRASIS, I've been with LYRASIS a little over 2 years, and as you might know, we host ArchivesSpace and Islandora and CollectionSpace. We also have not only Lori's team as the org home for ArchivesSpace, also the org home for CollectionSpace. We were in talks, maybe you heard last year, about merging with DuraSpace and got to know the open source platforms that they run. So we're gathering a lot of input around various platforms, how they're organized in the LAM, which is the library, archives, and museum space. Why should a software community look to integrate? Obviously, and ArchivesSpace is getting there with 330 members, and V2.0, 2.1 even, is out now. They look to the next step, and do you build on? Do you integrate? Some of the values, the value of integrating is that, of course, it can leverage the best functionality in each platform. And in particular, as I was just describing, we see the integration or the marriage of ArchivesSpace as a collection description with the digital asset management as very natural, because each of them augments the other. But some of the challenges, of course, is there are 2 platforms, there's 2 communities, that have to come together, not just this ArchivesSpace community, but Islandora has got its own thing. Are folks very familiar with Islandora in the room? A few. More Travelers Checks users than Islandora users, it looks like. So, and of course, you got to synchronize two distinct platforms. So, as I said, we saw this integration, this linking of these two platforms as natural, quote unquote natural, because the idea was to leverage the best functionality in each. So, what we've done, well, let me back up a half a step. I have on my team a gentleman named Mark Cooper, who many of you may know. He's pretty active in the software development, the ArchivesSpace software development community, code contributor, very knowledgeable of the ArchivesSpace platform. His counterpart on my team is a gentleman named Jonathan Green, who's very active in the Islandora community, used to work for Discovery Garden, if you've heard of them. And in January, Jonathan lives on Prince Edward Island, which is even east of the Eastern time zone. It's in the far northeast corner of Canada, and Mark is in the Bay Area. So I got those two guys together, and I asked them to spend 2 or 3 days thinking about this integration. My idea was they're just going to have them scope it out, and I would probably have to go find a grant to get enough funding to develop this integration. Well, in 2 days, they had a working prototype. So Mark built a plugin for ArchivesSpace, and Jonathan built what's called a solution pack for Islandora, and they had a working prototype in 2 days. So it gets to, and Lori will attest to this at LYRASIS, we talk about innovation and ideation and how you sort of get to the next level. And I tell my team, you can't think with what you don't know. And so that's why it's important to get, when you talk about larger integrations, you got to get experts from each side and put them together. And therefore, they can think together because they each know one side. So it was a fascinating case. What we've done is equate a digital object in ArchivesSpace with an item in Islandora. And we're sort of housing the quote-unquote official metadata, or the metadata of record will be on the digital object or its associated archival object in ArchivesSpace. And the plugin and the solution pack use the respective APIs. It's called a bisynchronous update. Each system updates the other. As you change an item in Islandora, it will reflect in ArchivesSpace and vice versa. We're at a beta stage with this. We're developing it within our hosting service for now. And we're using the general use case for the moment is just adding new items to each system. It's simpler, but there are a couple of additional use cases. We're addressing our items that are existing in one or both systems. It's some batch processing as you work with, especially with these digital asset management systems, digital assets you want to do in bulk, right? You want to load batches in, so we're addressing that. And it's a fairly complicated thing. We're working on associating the digital objects with their archival objects inside of ArchivesSpace, and that's a little bit tricky within this integration. We do have several pilot partners. I think we're up to 6 now. They're going to be helping us test this in the second half of this calendar year, so more is to come. Please stay tuned. That's it for me. Thanks.
Okay, now we have Alexandra Orchard.
Hi, I'm the Technical and Metadata Archivist at the Reuther Library. So I'm going to be sharing how we import our inventories at the Reuther rather than using RDE, and probably more importantly, why we do this, because knowing that will help you to determine if this trick or one like it would be useful for your institution. So to understand how we determine that importing inventories was the right workflow for us, you need to have a little bit of background. We began phasing in ArchivesSpace back in 2014, and we started making resource records in 2015, which included a big project for creating resource records for all of our legacy collections. And by legacy, I mean processed collections with Word and or PDF finding aids, and we had about 1,600 of these. Less than half of those had an EAD, and only about 300 of those EADs included inventories. And in this process, I quickly realized that it was actually faster to copy and paste the description from these finding aids directly from their Word and PDF guides directly into the resource record fields rather than updating the EADs or creating new EADs and importing them into ArchivesSpace. So that led to splitting the Legacy Resource Record project into two projects, the first of which was creating description-only resource records directly into a space for the legacy collections. And then after all of that work was done, we would go back into those resource records and add the inventories. So this was a beneficial solution for us because it meant that we could get our basic intellectual control over all of our processed collections much faster into ArchivesSpace, and thus end our dependency on FileMaker Pro as a collection management system sooner. Meanwhile, we began creating description-only resource records for collections that were currently being processed while continuing to use our Excel to PDF inventory procedure, and I'll get to why that's important to us in just a minute. So last fall, we wrapped up our legacy resource record project, and it was time to begin adding these inventories to the resource records. We had planned to import the inventories rather than use RDE since the very beginning, and this was for a few reasons. At the Ruther, we have really large collections. A lot of our collections, they're institutional records, so they're multi-box, many are 10, 50, 100 linear feet plus. So for us, using RDE was particularly slow and unwieldy given the number of folder titles we needed to include. Also, since many of the collections we were adding inventories to were our legacy collections, we were just copying and pasting. And it's a lot easier to copy and paste a long list rather than individual folder titles into RDE. And when I was testing this, I ran into a few other problems with RDE, including making all of the fields that I needed wide enough to see on my monitor. There was no spell check, and then sometimes RDE would lock up for me. And that was probably my internet or my browser, but still it was a real issue when I would get through a box and then I would lose everything. It made me sad. Then for the collections that I mentioned that were currently being processed, like those that we were doing during the legacy collection project, I mentioned that we were still using our Excel to PDF inventory procedures. So by importing the inventories, we could actually leverage that work. It was already done in Excel, and that's part of the importing workflow. So a large portion of the workflow had already been completed for these newer collections. And then finally, by importing, our staff was already familiar and comfortable with a large portion of the workflow, so it made staff buy-in easier, as well as the training process. So what is the process? For both our current and legacy collections, the process is pretty much the same with a few tweaks. The first thing we have to do is create the inventory in Excel. For our legacy collections, that just involves copying and pasting from the Word or PDF guide. Now, the downside is this is legacy data, so while the content is correct, the formatting is often a nightmare because a lot of these PDFs were just scanned from old typewritten documents and then OCR'd. And a lot of the Word docs originated in old versions of Word or WordPerfect, so there's a lot of format cleanup that we have to do. For the newer collections, those that are being currently processed, the inventories are simply typed directly into the Excel template. The template that we use includes hidden columns, and those contain EAD tags. Once you're finished typing in the inventory or copying and pasting, you unhide the columns that include those EAD tags, modify the tags so they accurately reflect the hierarchy of the collection, and then you just pull down, resulting in those tags being copied essentially. And then you have your inventory EAD'd. Then you want to open up your EAD XML template. This is just basically a dummy EAD in the sense that it just contains the very bare minimum tags that you need to get it into ArchivesSpace. You copy and paste the inventory from your Excel into the EAD document, and then you make a few other tweaks to that EAD XML template. You want to change the title, and then you also want to be sure to update the accession number. And I like to add an underscore INV. That way, once you import it into ArchivesSpace, you can tell the difference between your description resource record and your inventory resource record. So then you validate and save the EAD. You go back into ArchivesSpace. You'll just use a background job to import the EAD like you would anything else. And once that's successfully completed, you'll go back into your descriptive resource record that you're adding the inventory to, select merge, enter the title or accession number of the inventory you just imported, merge it. Abracadabra, your resource record now contains your inventory. So it's pretty easy, right? It's real short, simple. It is a long multi-step process, but we still find it a lot easier and more efficient for us than RDE. What we really, really want, and I was excited that other people were excited about this morning when we broke off into the focus groups, we just want a one-step import an inventory and a CSV directly into a resource record. And I was happy when I was doing research for this presentation that it looks like there's a solution that's well underway. If anyone is interested, it's JIRA AR935. Other archivists and institutions have requested a CSV import for resource records, especially component records like inventories. All the information is aggregated in that JIRA. It looks like Harvard's working on a plugin now. Yale, UAlbany, UNLV, and some other institutions have been working on this as well. I really think, as noted in that JIRA, the way to go is to get a standard CSV file that most folks agree on that's merged into the main code so that we have another option besides RDE. That's all I have. Thanks, everybody. If you're interested in the Excel or EAD templates, I'm happy to make those available.
And last but not least, we have Devon Proudfoot.
Hi, everyone. I'm lucky enough to work with the Bentley Historical Library's ArchivesSpace implementation team. So just a little bit of background. Last summer around SAA 2016, we began using ArchivesSpace for our legacy finding aids, as well as creating new resources, the creation of finding aids in general. So that has been successful, and after that, we moved on to accession records. So we wanted to put accession records into ArchivesSpace for collections management purposes, eventually tracking and barcoding. But one of the difficulties with that was that more people at the Bentley use the accession material than are creating finding aids. And so our implementation team consisted of only members of the curation team, so we really wanted to make sure that we heard what other members of the library wanted in terms of accessioning, looking through accession records, and even creating accession records. And so this is an image of our FileMaker Pro database, Beal. It works well for accessioning. You can see all of the normal accession fields. But we wanted to, like I said earlier, move into ArchivesSpace. And so one of the first things we did was interviewing members of the staff outside of our implementation team. So that meant archivists that were only in charge of processing collections, accessioning archivists, field archivists, and then even the library's development officers who were dealing with sending reports to the university, letting them know who has donated materials to us, that sort of thing. And one of the main things that we wanted to keep in mind was that we wanted to figure out what information users or the accessioning archivist wanted in ArchivesSpace rather than how we could replicate our fields from our old accessioning procedures. So we decided to use the information from our interviews and put them in the form of user stories. So for people that aren't familiar with user stories, these are typically used by developers for trying to figure out what the end user might be looking for. And so sometimes they can be in the format as a blank. I need to blank so that I can blank. And here's an example of a very simple one that we had. As a processing archivist, I need to know the donor so that I can establish provenance. So that's pretty straightforward, but we had about 70 or 80 of these. And so we have this large spreadsheet in Google Docs with all of our user stories. We have a blog post written by Max Eckert about how we've used user stories in the past. But these user stories, we wanted to kind of categorize them and figure out where they fit in with accessioning and sort of those processes. So this meant we had some in a donors or contact info section. We had a section on extent records, creating reports. And so finally, using these user stories, we were able to import our legacy data into ArchivesSpace, begin our training. So we've got new views of our accession records. We've got this legacy data in new fields, that sort of thing. And we were able to use the information we had learned from our colleagues to write up documentation as to how we wanted to present our accessions in the future, create training sessions, those types of things. And one of the nice things was utilizing some of ArchivesSpace's other features, so able to link multiple extents in terms of linear feet and oversized folders. We weren't able to do that before. Linking multiple donors to the same accession, those were a few nice things that we've been able to do since then. And so here's one of the direct example of the results of our user stories. So before we had a contact field, which would just supply a name. This was in addition to the donor record. So if the Bill Berman Foundation, if you wanted to link the secretary or someone along those lines, you would put that in the contact record. And so we found that our record managers and field archivists wanted to expand on that. So here's the user story itself. As a records manager, I need to add a list of all the members of the unit that assisted with the transfer of the material so that I can contact any of the staff should any questions arise. And in the curation division, we don't typically expand beyond this, but now those accessioning archivists are able to fill in these fields with as much information as they want. They could add names like we have here, or even telephone numbers, email addresses, those things. And so using this information, we were able to capture new or different information in the accessioning process, better tracking and reporting for who brought the material in. We were using an event for the field archivist, so they're able to run a report and figure out how much material they brought in within the past year. And in some cases, we found that just the free text field was sufficient. We didn't need to link an agent or anything with certain fields or certain areas of information. So free text was fine with us. And these user stories really affected more than I apologize for that formatting, really affected more than just our procedures. They helped us create training sessions, looking forward to creating reports, changing some display settings in ArchivesSpace. You can see we have an example of the accession record. Below the accession ID, we have the donor's name and the donor number, because that was something how the accession record would be displayed in our old database. So those types of things, the user stories really helped us to kind of move on with this, and it offered a sort of feedback cycle where accessioning archivists can speak with us and kind of figure out what they need to use ArchivesSpace for and how we can change our our material, our guidelines, and those types of things for the future. And so in summation of everything, user stories gave us a much more structured method of planning and kept us on track. And it really made things much easier for us. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you to all of our speakers. If you all have questions specifically for our speakers, that would be great. Does anyone want to come up to the mic? Yeah.
I have a question that might be for Alexis, or it might be for someone in the reports workshop that I wasn't able to go to. But I have ArchivesSpace set up to access through an ODBC connection. And when I try to look at notes, it just says OLE object, OLE object, OLE object, and I can't view them. Does anyone know how to get around that?
Are these in resource records? You mean?
So there are any notes that are like linked, that are like note subrecords. That are, so not just like a one section that's filled in, but when you're linking to like a scope and content, or, right. But it could be linked to anything.
So I haven't tried to do that. It looks like there's an answer behind you, though.
Mark, to the mic.
Mark has the answer. So we don't have our resource records in ArchivesSpace. I only pull accessions data, and I've never had that problem, but I'll let Mark answer.
So I don't know if that was on the live stream, but Mark said he could show our
Mark said that you have to get at the use MySQL to get at the underlying object. Actually, while I'm up here, I'll just say a word of caution. And this is a bug that we just encountered that we're in the process of figuring out what went wrong. But when transferring records, that sometimes causes a bug with duplicate events, and it will break your database. And it's and there's a solution to it. If this happens to you, there is a plugin that LYRASIS provided us, and so we were able to fix our database. But she was sick for a long time, and it was really scary. We were all really worried about her. So just be cautious when you're transferring records that the linked events can spawn.
Any other questions for presenters? If people have also more general questions, that's fine. Maybe somebody else from the audience would be able to answer it for you. I know folks last year were really gung-ho about having some more just general meeting, let's talk to each other time. So if there's anything burning that you really want to address, feel free to come up to the mic. No, everybody's quiet this year. Long day for everybody. Okay, that's perfectly fine too. So Christine's going to come up to the front and do the wrap-up for you guys. Thanks very much.
Thank you to our panel. Has everyone had enough archive space yet? Do you want more archive space? So I don't really have much to say here, except to say thank you to all of you for coming out. If anyone still has some burning questions that you want answered, or a burning comment that you want to air in front of this group, this would be the time to do that. Please feel free to do that. The next thing after this, if you haven't had enough archive space, is we do have a post-forum mixer being co-hosted by two of our registered service providers, Atlas Systems and LYRASIS, and that's going to be back at the Hilton, the main SAA hotel in the Skyline room. Starts at 5:30, runs to 7, though I've been told we have the room for much longer than that, but the food and drink will have run out by then. But if you want some time to continue to talk archive space or not talk archive space but still hang out with each other, that's a venue for you to do that. So before I let you go, does anyone have any questions, comments, anything else, anything you want to make sure that we cover during this week while we're all here in Portland? Well, again, thank you, everybody, for being here today. Thank you for coming out with all the many other options that are there. We are going to be sending, we have a evaluation that we'd love for you to fill out. It's on the on-site program. The link is there. And we'll also probably be sending you out an email tomorrow or maybe the next day with the link. Please do respond to that because that helps us make events like this better. And as I mentioned this morning, we're looking to do more events this year as well. So even if you have an idea that you don't think is necessarily great for the member forum itself, there may be another kind of opportunity that we could use that idea for. So please do respond to the survey and please do give us your feedback. So again, thank you everybody for sticking around and we look forward to catching up with you more later in the week as well.